While most people think of World War II machine guns, they usually picture the German ones, the MG-34 and the MG-42, and to be fair, those guns earned that reputation. But while much of the attention stayed on Germany's machine guns, there was another weapon quietly becoming one of the most useful and destructive systems of the entire war. The M2 Browning. Not because of how fast it fired, but because of what it could do. It wasn't limited to one role. It showed up everywhere, on trucks, on tanks, on ships, and most importantly, in the air. Wherever US forces went, the M2 usually went with them, a time when armies were just starting to realize that their weapons were no longer enough. And somehow this same weapon is still in service today, almost unchanged. So what made the M2 Browning nearly impossible to replace? To understand that, we have to go back to World War I. By that point, machine guns had already proven how decisive they were. But there was one problem: almost all of them were still firing the same kind of ammunition as infantry rifles. That worked fine, as long as the target was a person, but the battlefield was changing. Armored vehicles started appearing, early tanks, reinforced positions. And above them, aircraft that were becoming harder to bring down. Suddenly, rifle-caliber fire wasn't enough anymore. You could hit the target, but not stop it. And that created a serious problem. Now, someone needed to think ahead. Not just improve existing weapons, but build something entirely different, something with more reach, more impact, and enough power to deal with armor. That requirement eventually reached John Moses Browning, and the request was simple: build a machine gun that could hit harder than anything currently in service. What followed wasn't just a new weapon. It was the beginning of something that would outlast every war it was built for. The requirement that reached John Moses Browning wasn't small. The U.S. military didn't just want another machine gun, they wanted something with significantly more power than the .30 caliber weapons already in service. Something capable of dealing with armor and aircraft, at a time when both were evolving quickly. Browning's approach was practical. Instead of starting completely from scratch, he took a design that already worked, and scaled it up. The idea was simple: if the existing system was reliable, then a larger, more powerful version could solve the new problem. But the real challenge wasn't just the gun, it was the ammunition. Because to achieve the kind of performance the military wanted, the cartridge itself had to change. What came out of that process was the 12.7 by 99 mm NATO .50 BMG. Designed to travel fast, hit hard, and maintain energy over long distances. At the time, it was a massive step up, and more importantly, it solved multiple problems at once. It could damage lightly armored targets, it could reach aircraft, and it delivered far more impact than standard rifle rounds. The first weapon built around it wasn't even the final version people recognize today, but it proved one thing very clearly: this concept worked. The early heavy machine gun that came out of this effort was powerful, but it wasn't perfect. In fact, it had some serious limitations. The first versions were heavy, extremely heavy. In their original configurations they were difficult to move, difficult to set up, and not exactly practical for fast-moving units. That created a problem. Because while the weapon had the power the military wanted, it didn't yet have the flexibility. Early aircraft struggled to carry it, ground crews had to deal with its weight, and mounting it efficiently on vehicles wasn't always straightforward. For a while, it looked like this might end up being a very specialized weapon, useful in certain roles, but not something widely adopted across the battlefield. And then, the design started to evolve. Engineers refined it, adjusted how it could be mounted, improved how it operated, and over time, those changes led to a version that was far more adaptable. A version that could be used on different platforms, without needing a completely new design each time. That version became the M2 Browning, and once it reached that point, it didn't stay limited for long. By the time World War II began, the M2 Browning was no longer just an idea. It was ready, and more importantly, it was available in numbers, and once the war started it didn't stay in one place, it spread across the entire battlefield. On land, at sea, and in the air. That flexibility turned out to be one of its biggest advantages, because instead of designing different weapons for different roles, the U.S. military could rely on one system, and adapt it as needed. In air, the M2 made one of its biggest impacts. American aircraft didn't rely on just one or two guns, they carried multiple. A single B-17 Flying Fortress could be equipped with over a dozen M2 machine guns, positioned across the aircraft, covering almost every angle. The idea was simple: if enemy fighters approached, they wouldn't face a single defensive gun, they would fly into a wall of heavy fire. And because of the .50 caliber round, it didn't take many hits to cause serious damage. That changed how air combat worked. Attacking a bomber formation became far more dangerous, and every pass had to be calculated carefully. On land, the story was similar. The M2 didn't stay fixed in one role. It was mounted on trucks, half-tracks, tanks, and anything that could carry it. That meant U.S. forces could bring heavy firepower, almost anywhere. And unlike lighter machine guns, this wasn't just for suppressing infantry. It could engage vehicles, break through cover, and dominate open ground at longer ranges. Positions that might stop rifle-caliber fire didn't hold up the same way against a .50, and once multiple guns were used together, the effect multiplied quickly. The same pattern continued at sea. Ships used the M2 primarily for defense, especially against low-flying aircraft. It wasn't the largest weapon on a ship, but it was one of the most practical, reliable, easy to operate, and effective at close range. What started as a response to armored threats in the First World War, had now become something much broader. German forces encountered it everywhere, and the effect wasn't the same as lighter weapons. The range was greater, the impact was heavier, and cover that might stop smaller rounds wasn't always enough anymore. That forced adjustments, because pushing directly into that kind of fire came at a cost. By the later stages of the war, the M2 wasn't just another weapon in service, it had become part of how the U.S. military operated. When World War II ended, a lot of weapons disappeared with it. Replaced by newer designs, built for a different kind of war, but the M2 Browning didn't. It carried on into the Korean War where terrain, weather, and distance once again made heavy firepower valuable. Then into the Vietnam War where it was mounted on patrol boats, vehicles, and defensive positions. And it didn't stop there. Decades later, it was still being mounted on vehicles moving through deserts, guarding convoys, and providing overwatch in places far removed from where it was first designed. And once a weapon reaches that level of use, replacing it becomes much harder. By now, the obvious question is, why? Why keep a weapon designed nearly a century ago when technology has moved so far ahead? The answer isn't just one thing. It's a combination. Firstly, the 12.7 by 99 mm NATO, .50 BMG, still delivers a level of impact that most standard machine guns simply don't match. It can engage targets at longer ranges and remain effective when lighter rounds start to lose their advantage. Next comes reliability. The design is simple enough to keep working even in harsh conditions, dust, heat, cold. Environments change but the weapon keeps functioning. Third comes versatility. It isn't locked into one role, it can be mounted on vehicles, used in defensive positions, adapted for different platforms without redesigning the entire system, and that matters more than it seems. Because replacing a weapon like this isn't just about building something better on paper. It has to perform across all those roles, just as reliably, just as consistently, and so far nothing has managed to do that well enough to take its place. Most weapons are built for a specific moment in time, but the M2 Browning followed a different path. It started as a response to a problem that didn't go away. And because of that, it never really became outdated, it adapted, it carried forward, from trenches, to bombers, to modern battlefields. And even now it continues to do the same job it was designed for. Not because it hasn't been replaced, but because nothing has truly made it unnecessary.